and welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Scott Stevens, filling in for Amanda Vanstone, who's taking a bit of a break. Coming up on today's program, there's a growing phenomenon at universities and colleges in many parts of the globe where students are attempting to sanitize campuses of subjects that might cause offense. We saw an example of this just last week when students in Wales petitioned to ban Germaine Greer from speaking at Cardiff University because of comments she made on transgenderism. In the US, it's been branded the coddling of the American mind. We'll talk to Greg Lukianoff, CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, later in the program. Also today, domestic violence. It's on the rise in Australia, and state and federal governments are throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem. One commentator says it's a waste of time because it ignores where the real problem lies. She argues that the issue has been hijacked by the feminist movement, who've made domestic violence all about gender. All that and more today on Counterpoint. But first, to Britain and Europe, where Germaine Greer is at war with university students. What else is new? The World Health Organization has felt the wrath of carnivores the world over, and Turkey has confirmed that it's been shelling Kurdish fighters in Syria. Time to talk to our regular commentator, the editor of Spiked Online, Brendan O'Neill, who this week is not in Blighty, but is in fact in the Big Apple. Brendan, hello.
Hi there.
Okay, so Germaine Greer, she's been accused by university students at Cardiff of being transphobic because she expressed her opinion that having a sex change operation doesn't in fact make you a woman. An opinion, I should say, that would have been shared by the vast majority of her entire generation of feminists. Greer is due to deliver a lecture on women in power at Cardiff later this month. Is that still going ahead?
Well, it's unclear. It seems like it's still going ahead, but it's not certain at the moment. But what I find remarkable about the whole thing is that her talk at Cardiff has nothing to do with trans people or transgenderism. It was about, as you say, it's about women and power, the progress made by women in the 20th century. It's about her field of expertise, the things she's been writing about and agitating on and fighting for 40 or 50 years, while lots of these brats were not even a twinkle in their father's eyes. And yet what you have is this kind of intolerant clampdown by these students at Cardiff over something she said 10 or 15 years ago, and over a point of view she still holds, which is that men who have sex change surgery do not become women, which in my view, it's perfectly legitimate for her to hold that outlook on life. But students today, particularly in Britain, are intolerant of any view which doesn't 100% marry up with theirs, and so they want her off their campus.
Sorry, Brendan, you've got to explain this to me. I mean, we see flickers of this, I think, in the US. I think we're seeing this increasingly in the US. We'll be talking to someone later in the program about exactly this. How on earth did this happen? I mean, this is not the university climate, for instance, that I grew up in.
It's something really odd has happened on university campuses over the past 10 or 20 years, where, you would expect a university to be a place where any idea can be debated, any proposition could be put forward, any book could be read and discussed and talked about. But that has changed dramatically in recent years, where now, particularly among students rather than among academics, they are intolerant of anything which they don't agree with. So on British campuses, for example, far-right people are no longer allowed to speak. Zionists are often hounded off campus. Feminists who don't 100% agree on the politics of transgenderism are increasingly being no-platformed. That's where they are denied a platform on a university across Britain. Lads magazines have been banned. The Sun newspaper has been banned on some campuses. Blurred Lines, Robin Thicke's pop song Blurred Lines, has been banned in more than 30 universities in Britain on the basis that it is sexist and damaging to women. So across universities, we've seen the censorship of music, controversial speakers, magazines, books. And this is a real turnaround because, just 30 or 40 years ago, you would have expected students to be at the cutting edge of demanding the right to see and say and hear and spread any idea that they wanted to. In fact, students often fought for freedom of speech, but now they do the precise opposite. So it's a very worrying climate, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, the WHO has reported that processed meats like bacon, sausages, ham belong in the same carcinogenic category as cigarettes. Now, look, I'm a vegetarian, but the rest of you guys are screwed. Let me just say that. They've also said that red meat probably causes cancer, especially bowel cancer. Now, admittedly, some of the nuance of the WHO's report's been lost in transmission, and yet it's been met with howls of defiance and despair in Australia. How are you Northern Hemisphere carnivores faring with the news?
There is a fight back. I think we're seeing the emergence of what we might call a bacon defense league in Europe. You know, which is great because I'm a huge fan of bacon, and also the World Health Organization's report and particularly some of the media coverage of it has just been hysterical. I mean, it Absolutely. Is unadulterated politics of fear. That's what it is. So, you know, what's basically being argued that if a man over 50 who eats bacon, if he eats bacon, he increases his risk of getting bowel cancer from 0.68% to 0.8%. I mean, it is statistically insignificant. You know, by comparison, if you smoke, your risk of lung cancer goes up by 2,000%. So this is what we're talking about, a tiny, insignificant, tiny rise in the risk of getting bowel cancer if you eat processed meat. It just has no impact on people's lives, yet it's been pushed by the World Health Organization. It's been interpreted by a lot of the media as, you know, meat is dangerous. But what's been quite positive is that in Austria and Germany in particular, where bratwursts are very popular and cold cuts of meat are, you know, the staple breakfast food, there's been a fight back in those countries. And also in Italy, the food ministers in these countries have accused the World Health Organization of alarmism and scaremongering. And I'm really pleased to see that. I think it's about time we kicked back against these food miserabilists.
Fabulous. I think we're inventing a whole series of new political categories as we go. This is great. Well, look, on a more serious note, and I've got to confess, this one really, really puzzles me. Turkey's confirmed that it's been bombing Kurdish fighters in Syria. Now, they've targeted the Kurdish separatist group known as the PKK, which is widely listed as a terrorist group. But the PKK and its allies with the Free Syrian Army have been working closely with U.S. forces in fighting Islamic State. And Turkey is fighting Islamic State. Brendan, you've got to explain this to me. Why is Turkey now bombing the PKK?
To my mind, this is the biggest scandal in international affairs at the moment. I think it's really disturbing, really shocking. What happened is that starting in July, the Turks started to bomb mainly the PKK, who, as you say, they list as a terrorist organization. They've been in conflict with the PKK since the mid-1980s. So, you know, there's no love lost between Turkey and the PKK. But the PKK was working with Syrian Kurds, particularly in the YPGs, which are the Syrian Kurdish forces, who have been doing a fantastic job of holding back ISIS and taking towns back from ISIS and keeping them at bay, not only from Kurdish territory, but also from other groups of people in that region. They've done a really valiant job. And so in bombing the PKK, and now increasingly, the thing that's been revealed this week is that Turkey has also been attacking the YPGs. I think we're stabbing the Kurds in the back. For the past year or two, Western leaders in Washington, London and elsewhere praised the Kurds, thanked them for all the work they're doing, told them they're doing a wonderful job. And now it seems that they are giving a nod of approval, or at least are turning a blind eye to the fact that their ally of Turkey is now bombing the Kurds. I think this is a scandal of epic proportions. It is a real betrayal of the Kurds, and it deserves to be more controversial than it is.
Alrighty, thanks so much, Brendan. That's Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online, and he's joining us today from New York City. I'm Scott Stevens. You're listening to Counterpoint here on RN. Many of us fondly remember university as a robust and often raucous intellectual environment. An environment where we were all trying to discover what we think about the big questions of life, where we were trying to discover our moral bearings, make sense of the world, and find our place within it. Intellectual inquiry, often intemperate ways of expressing yourself, but above all, relentlessly pushing back against the status quo. For better or worse, these are the ingredients of the formative experience of university life. But over the last few years, we've seen a different sort of intellectual climate taking hold at colleges and universities. In the US, primarily, but also in many other parts of the world. We've seen it here, they've seen it recently in the UK, as we've just discussed. A climate in which students have set out to sanitize the campus of subjects and of language and of ideas that might cause varying degrees of offense. That attempt to sanitize might take the form of requesting that lecturers don't use certain language within lectures, or even putting trigger warnings on the covers of classics of Western literature. In the US, this is being called the coddling of the American mind. And we're going to talk to Greg Lukianoff, who's CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, to try to help us understand what on earth is going on in this land that's been championing for so long free speech and the right to unfettered inquiry. Greg, can you help us to understand where did this come from?
Well, I will do my best. I've been doing this since about 2001, and I'm an American First Amendment attorney, and that means my specialization is in defending freedom of speech. And I was the odd lawyer in that I went to law school to specialize in freedom of speech. I worked for the American Civil Liberties Union in the U.S., and for most of my career defending the free speech rights of students on campus, which is what my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, does, I've been combating what are usually just overzealous administrators who are sort of, in some cases it's political, but in a lot of cases it was more personal. A university doesn't like being criticized, an administrator has it out for a student or a faculty member, kind of typical censorship dynamic stuff. In the past 2 years, what's really scary to me is that a lot of the demand for speech policing at every level seems to be coming from the students themselves. I think that ultimately, as cultures become more affluent, as you have more opportunities to shield yourself from opinions with which you disagree, to consume media that reflects your existing point of view, even to move into neighborhoods that are more politically homogeneous, that I think we become less capable of dealing with conflict, and that includes ideas that offend us and discussions that make us uncomfortable. So to a degree, I see this as almost an inevitable problem that society is going to face, not just as things are getting better in other areas, but precisely because things are getting better.
Let's try to pick a few of these ideas apart, because in some ways what we're talking about here is a kind of extension, but you could even say a kind of devolution or bastardization of some of the more noble objectives that lay behind the politically correct movement, which really tried to take aim, I thought, and I still think, at some of the, say, power imbalances and injustices that have become entrenched in everyday language. But this seems to be something very different.
Yeah, definitely a major distinction I see, and there are similarities, don't get me wrong, there are serious similarities between sort of the first so-called heyday of political correctness back in the 80s and 90s. It at least had an element of empowerment. It had an idea. It also had an element of sort of suspicion of authority. The empowerment part says you are brave, you are strong, you are courageous, and that you can deal with the ordinary abrasions of everyday life. You want to be challenged, and you want to challenge right back, was very much part of the first political correctness movement. And one of the reasons why it was a joy to work with John Haidt on the Atlantic article was because even though I'm a First Amendment lawyer, I also study a lot about psychology. And the thing that I think is so distressing about a lot of the what I will go so far as to call pseudo-psychological underpinnings of the rationales for a lot of the speech policing is that it's based on ideas that people are incredibly fragile, which is inherently a disempowering idea. And I take it a step further in the article by explaining it's not just disempowering, it's a formula for anxiety and depression. If you basically think that any abrasion, any conflict that you have is going to leave you not smarter and stronger and better and cleverer, but rather broken forever, that's a terrible way to look at the world, and it's also not backed up by research.
Okay, so is this one of the reasons, for instance, that we seem to be seeing a massive expansion of the definition of ideas or terms like hate speech, or the expansion of what might classify as sexual harassment? In other words, is this underlying sense of emotional fragility kind of bubbling up to these linguistic levels?
I definitely think that's part of it. I definitely think it's sort of a runaway process of, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed writing with Haidt is he wrote this great book called The Righteous Mind, where he talks about different kinds of morality. And he talks about how in America, that particularly people who used to be political liberals increasingly think of any justification, as long as you're showing care for a victim group, is justified, even if it doesn't necessarily make all that much sense. And if you have the situation in which that is as politically homogeneous as American campuses, which are frankly pretty politically homogeneous these days, you don't have a lot of pushback. So you end up having this sort of runaway process. And now they don't call it hate speech. It goes way beyond hate speech now. Now they've moved into microaggressions. This idea that, and I want to be clear, I think the study of microaggressions is fascinating. I'm all for studying them. But the idea that you can be held accountable for some unconsciously uncouth, possibly, thing that someone else might interpret you as saying, is a formula for completely shutting down people talking to each other in genuine candor across lines of difference.
I can't help but think, though, Greg, that in many ways what we're seeing here playing out at a very interpersonal level, at the level of sort of relationships between students and students, I mean, this in some ways is a kind of version of what we've been seeing increasingly in the sort of hyper-partisan character of modern politics, where both sides view each other in terms of a zero-sum game, where the whole nature of political rhetoric isn't in fact to persuade, but simply to appeal to one's constituency. It feels as though that kind of hyper-partisanship is almost trickling down even into interpersonal relations.
That's an excellent point. Super political polarization is a big part of it. And I think that when you come to see people who disagree with you as either stupid or evil as being the only two possibilities, then this is what naturally results. So one way that we're trying to remedy that at FIRE, my organization, is to host debates on campus, and to have smart people on either side and point out, look, decent people can disagree. The sky did not fall if you have this debate. This is actually good for you. But I do think that yes, I do think that this is it's like the next step of acceleration in the culture wars when we already are like these two armed camps, actually kind of in America literally, who increasingly distrust and dislike each other.
So an awful lot of what you're saying as well, anybody who's spent 5 minutes on social media recognizes exactly what you've just said. I mean, social media is not the platform for persuasion. It's the platform in which you register your disagreement, you marshal campaigns, you get as many people as you possibly can on your side, and you shame the hell out of whoever's against you. Do you have any sense of which came first? Is it a certain movement among students or among young people that's created this climate in social media, or is it social media that's in some ways reinforcing a kind of latent disposition?
I definitely think there's an interrelationship, but I will say that in Twitter's early days, I was one of the biggest proponents of it because it was like looking at the collective unconscious of the entire species. Because people would just immediately say whatever came to their mind, and as someone who's interested in psychology, it's amazing to think how people what the first thing that comes out of someone's mouth when they see something on TV that upsets them, or hear something on the radio, or get into an argument with their friend. It's this very intimate look into the messy the nature of human psychology. But in the past couple of years, it has turned more into this thing that reinforces this political polarization we talked about. And so much so that we're actually coming out with a movie called Can We Take a Joke? Where we talk to comedians about how it's really hard to be a comedian in an age where people insist to not find, there's 90% of your best jokes funny.
One of the great concepts that I've always loved from Aristotle is that emotions are and must be trained, that there actually is part and parcel of the education process that leads people into the proper use of emotions. In other words, simply emoting, simply bursting out is a fundamentally adolescent or even puerile way of responding to the world, whereas part and parcel of education, of culture, of theater is to train young people. These things are beautiful. Love them. These things are ugly. Run away from them. This kind of schooling, the training of the emotions. I can't help but wonder, given the fact that so much of public debate is simply this emoting, simply allowing one's initial response to things to take over, if you like, and then in turn to give that a kind of moral status where, you've offended me, you've questioned my identity, you've offended my sense of well-being. I do just wonder how much of this kind of emotional robustness or emotional formation ought now to be part of the priority of serious higher education.
Anytime you say an argument about sort of, get your emotions in check or be critical of your emotions, you should be ready to be, pilloried on campus these days. Which is because you're never supposed to question someone's sincerely held feelings. I tried to take this on from a psychology standpoint in the Atlantic article and talk about cognitive distortions. And one of the most classic cognitive distortions, and these are things that little interior narratives that you engage in that can make you anxious or miserable, where essentially you say, I'm the worst person in the world. And of course, rationally, you're not the worst person in the world. Or this is the worst thing that's ever happened. Of course, that's not true, but we all think these things. And one cognitive distortion is called emotional reasoning, where essentially you feel something, and therefore your immediate response, if you're not very emotionally mature, is something has to be done. Some action needs to be taken. And one of the things that they teach you to get over anxiety and depression is that sometimes you just feel a certain way. But to say this on campus, is to say that you're invalidating my feelings. And really the argument that we were making in the Atlantic is this very humble argument that I think we'd probably be doing much better, we'd be having much more productive conversations if we just stopped for a second, looked at what we were saying and thinking, and asked ourselves, is this exaggerated? Is this over the top? Am I overreacting? A little bit of critical self-reflection would go a long way right now.
You've been fairly critical of calls from some presidents of universities for civility in public debate or in civility in public discourse. You've been quite suspicious that, as John Stuart Mill incidentally was, that civility oftentimes can be a very benign or seemingly innocent way of imposing a kind of conformity. Part of me, given the fact that Australian public debate is so uncivil, and not to even mention how things are with you fine folks on the other side of the Pacific. Part of me thinks, my God, don't we really need more civility in public debate? But I do just wonder, isn't what we're really after here something a bit more like empathy?
And I do want to clear something up. When university presidents have called for, a civil, rational discussion, well, generally our FIRE's position is, you can call for that. And if you're saying aspirational language that says there are better ways to argue, then nobody agrees with you more than me. But when it comes to anything that sounds like you be civil by my definition or else, that's where we disagree. That being said, I think we're wasting so much cognitive energy, so much emotional energy on arguments that are getting us nowhere. And I know it's even going to sound naive, but some reintroduction of some rational evaluation of the way we argue about things and try to figure out solutions to problems, I think if we were to harness just a tiny, tiny fraction of the energy that we currently spend on outrage to fixing things, we'd be living in a much, much better world.
I'm going to put you on the spot. I want to ask you a predictive question. Sure. There is no chance of our political leaders leading the way in terms of exemplifying better, civil, empathetic public discourse. I can't think of any other social or public institution that can give this generation and the next the kind of emotional fortitude, the kind of skills and persuasion that's necessary to live civilly and peaceably and well. I can't think of any other institution than university that's more capable of doing that. Is higher education in the United States and elsewhere, is it up to the challenge to fix this? I think quite a serious problem with our social fabric. Is university up to it, or is it going to become sort of ground zero of the problems that we're going to be reaping for the next few decades?
I'm going to give you an intellectually honest but possibly unsatisfactory answer if I don't know. And I hope it is, and I see glimmers every so often that it is, but I don't know, partially because universities, to a degree, have created this monster that we see, particularly the very exaggerated cases you see where people are actually setting up committees to police unintentional slights. That's coming from universities. So they have to really take a look at themselves and what they're teaching. Is there a possibility, though? For example, like if we were to, have students engage in Oxford-style debates, I think that would help. I think that, making sure that that's actually considered to be something that's featured as something fun and productive, that could go a long way to helping, but I don't see enough university professors thinking that. That being said, now that professors are getting in trouble on a more regular basis, I think there is a little bit more awareness on campuses among the people who lead them, that we have to do something to return some amount of, quality, rational debate and discussion to campuses, and that they are the ones who should have been teaching this all along.
On that rather hedged bet, let's call it, let's thank Greg Lukianoff, CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you so much, Greg, for your time and for your passion and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, to the issue of domestic violence in Australia. It's something we hear about in the media almost daily, whether it's the latest awful incident or the newest weapon in the fight against it. Just last week, Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety released stats showing that domestic violence is a much bigger problem in this country than we first thought. It showed that a staggering 1 in 4 Australian women, that's 2.2 million women, have experienced violence at the hands of a partner. Governments at state and federal level are throwing money at the problem, setting up education programs to engender more respect for women. But is this really the answer? Well, our guest says it's not. And she also contends that the issue of domestic violence has been hijacked by the feminist movement, who have turned it into a gender issue. As a result, we're ignoring where the real problems lie. Angela Shanahan is a journalist and commentator with the Australian newspaper. She joins us from our Canberra studio. Angela, welcome to Counterpoint.
Hello, Scott.
You say that the massive injection of federal funds, some $100 million, to create a new culture of respect for women just won't work because it doesn't address the real problem. So let me ask you, what is the real problem?
Well, I think when you get statistics like from organisations like the National Institute for Women's Safety, then I think that's part of the real problem. Because, this is a feminist organisation which wants to push a certain line on this particular problem. I think the real problem with domestic violence is the breakdown of the protective nuclear family, which in itself is a protection against domestic violence. The other thing we have to think about with this is, what do we mean by domestic? What do we mean by partner? What do we mean by violence? A lot of these things are being submerged into a great welter of anti-male rhetoric. For instance, you take the word domestic. What do we mean by domestic? I think the picture in a lot of people's minds is sort of dad coming home drunk and beating up mum. But which women are actually more prone to violence? Unmarried women are. Which men are more prone to dish it out? Especially to children. To use the kind of official language, it's the resident unrelated male, the boyfriend. And who are more likely to actually harm or kill children? The mothers are. You see, a lot of this has as its base, men are often the abusers, so therefore all men are abusers.
Or at least all men are abusers in waiting, or kind of ticking time. Or
potential, exactly. Potential abusers. Yeah. So, what we're getting from the media, from the government, from everyone on domestic violence is that this is a gender issue. And it isn't a gender issue. It's not a natural thing that just happens because, men are men. It's actually a familial problem. It's actually a problem of the breakdown of all the protective factors in society, the things that can protect the vulnerable. That's why the worst domestic violence in the whole country is in Indigenous communities. And these places are also awash with alcohol and drugs and pornography.
There are a lot of things here that you've kind of laid out. It's kind of difficult to know where to begin because it really is a knot of interrelated issues. Let me see if I can begin at this point,
yes,
though.
It is.
One of the well-rehearsed progressive narratives in the post-war period is that the government has at its disposal a number of different levers. There are certain education programs, there are certain social programs, there are certain things that can be tinkered with and things that can be funded in order to achieve the desired social outcome. What you're actually describing in many ways is that that precisely because domestic violence is a social issue embedded within the particular dynamics of particular families, the role of government in this is actually severely limited. Have I overstated your point?
Yes. No, I don't think you have. I think that's exactly right. I don't think the government can do anything about it. I mean, $100 million is an awful lot of anti-domestic violence posters, but aside from that, I don't think the government can do anything about something which is embedded now in the kind of fluidity which stops us from supporting the strong nuclear family. So you're talking about all these things that have emerged since the Second World War, ways of tinkering with things. And none of that is as good as your own family. For instance, this idea that we can teach children relationships at school is such a lot of, BS, frankly. I actually guffawed out loud when I read that, because the best education you have about relationships, about respect between, the mother and the father, that you can teach the children is in their own family. You're not going to actually teach kids relationships. You can't do that. You can instill politeness, you can instill a certain amount of social respect in the classroom, you can talk about in religion, for example, you can talk about ethics and morality and the way you should treat other people, but you can't really make children understand this in their being, in how they behave, unless they see it in their own families. And if they're not in intact families, and in fact, I'm not the only one saying this, they're not going to learn that. One of the most interesting things, is that there's two lines going on here. There's the official line where, somehow all these government programs and so forth can do stuff. And then there's the other line where people can see the bleeding obvious, to be frank. In 2011, Patrick Parkinson put out a really good report called For the Kids' Sake. And it was about what happens to children when the family as a protective structure breaks down. I mean, that's what we're really seeing now. I
remember Patrick's report well, though. But, Angela, I can't let you off the hook completely, though, on the gender issue. I accept what you say that the family, a strong family, is the best bulwark against domestic violence. I accept what you say that the best way of exemplifying good gender roles is simply by exemplifying good gender roles. I accept that. But isn't there substantive work to be done at a cultural level, in mass culture, in literature, to some extent even in education, to give kids a countervailing understanding of the way in which men and women can in fact view each other, that isn't simply dominated by various forms of barely sanitized violence on televisions, in games, in music, and so forth. In other words, gender is part of this. There is something. If
gender is part of it, it's only because you have to look at the female end of the spectrum as well as the male.
Right. For
40 years, we've been telling girls they can do anything they like. For 40 years, we've been telling girls they can basically just act any way they like, that all the barriers of sexual propriety are broken down, so don't worry about them. I have to be frank with you. An awful lot of women get themselves into situations. So what are you going to do? Is it just all the male's fault? Of course, if a male hits a woman, then that's wrong. He shouldn't hit women. People shouldn't obviously hit one another. I mean, the interesting thing is, you might find this odd, but of the assaults that I quoted in the article I wrote in The Spectator, an article by a fellow called Chris Lloyd, who is a statistician. And instead of looking at just the police reports, he also looked at the ABS reports on personal safety. And they actually surveyed 17,000 households on this. Of the assaults that were reported by women, 25% of them were from other women. So it's not just a matter of the way that men and women behave towards each other. I certainly think that we could do a lot more to encourage a sense of boundaries and a sense of propriety. But what do you do when for example, the rate of exnuptial births is now up to, well, probably over 37% now. And there are girls who are stuck with children who might have a live-in boyfriend who might be a decent bloke, but then again he might not be, and then they go to another one, and then they go to another one. This kind of fluidity is just a natural sort of red light on domestic violence. So, you know, as you said before, it's terribly complex. Now, I'm the mother of 6 boys. I don't obviously encourage them to go around throwing their weight around. But you can't naturally assume that because blokes like, you know, physical stuff, that this is an unnatural thing for them to like. Now, of course, they shouldn't lose their temper and take it out on the girls. You see this in school. I was a teacher for 15 years, and even the bounds of propriety between the boys and girls in school is starting to break down.
So we're reaping the whirlwind, essentially.
I do think
decades and decades of breakdown of fundamental social structures and fundamental family relationships.
And also a sense of propriety. I think just in the ordinary social realm, you know, kids going out at night, getting drunk, you know, things occur. It's as simple as that. And we have to kind of protect our girls against that by warning them. But we have to protect our boys too. And I think you're right in that obviously that's the case. But this will only happen in a good family. It doesn't happen where 13 and 14-year-old kids are allowed to get on the train and go into town and do whatever they like.
Now, Angela, you do make some very precise, practical recommendations for what this money could in fact be used for, or certain procedures that could in fact be put into place to make things better. I mean, one of the things that struck me about your piece is that you say on the one hand that this really is a particular issue, particular men and women. It can't be generalized out to gender as such. It's a particular issue, particular men and women. But you say that one of the ways that something really can be done is at the level of policing itself. And so you say, for instance, there have been certain failures in policing, the failure to enforce intervention orders. You say that there's probably
the number of AVOs.
Yes. Now that's interesting. So on the one hand, you're also saying that there's a kind of overly broad definition of domestic violence, and that the use of apprehended violence orders is itself problematic, that those are being applied for, or those are being handed out a bit too liberally. What are you saying there?
I think both. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I think both. I'm not the only person that says this. The police themselves are tearing their hair out because they don't really know what to do. They feel they must do something. That's the reason that there are so many AVOs. The other thing is, look, you take the Luke Batty case. I mean, that's the one that's brought all this to attention. No one seems to be asking, I mean, why do we need more money to tell us that a madman who had 4 outstanding arrest warrants and numerous intervention orders shouldn't have been let loose to kill that child?
But everything about what you've been saying has been screaming that maybe some of the oversimplified narrative that we're used to hearing, it's much more complex than that. The causes are more complex. The ways to address it need to be a bit more complex and a bit more fluid. I do have to ask you, though, just as a final question, I mean, one of the things you've criticized is an overly broad definition of domestic violence. One of the things, though, that testimonies from various survivors of domestic violence is that the ways in which they suffer violence, or the way in which they've experienced violence, does vary quite dramatically from situation to situation. So how do we, my question, I suppose, is how do we hold these two things together? You don't want to leave too much room open for abuse because that has the effects that we've just been talking about. At the same time, there's something about the particularity of the individual experiences that need to somehow be taken into account of.
Yes, but this actually illustrates my point. My point is this: there are lots of different forms of abuse. I know full well that there are women who are controlled, who have all sorts of terrible things happen to them in private, who have their money taken away from them, whose whole psyche is somehow controlled. But can you really do anything about that? Can the government do anything about that? Can the police do anything about that? I don't think so. And that's the point I was trying to make. If you start broadening out. It's all very well for the feminists to say, oh, we have to broaden the definitions of domestic violence. Well, yeah, but how are you going to prove any of this stuff? How are you going to actually do anything about it? And really, is it the business of the police and everybody else to do anything about it? If it isn't that woman's business, then whose business is it?
Angela Shanahan, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us today on Counterpoint.
Thanks, Scott.
Over the last 2 decades, no issue has been as politically divisive or as politically expedient as that of our national response to the arrival of asylum seekers by boat. After then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd relaxed the measures that had been so successful in deterring asylum seekers under John Howard, measures like mandatory offshore detention, forced towbacks, no permanent resettlement, there was an explosion of new boat arrivals. Between January 2012 and July 2013, more than 30,000 asylum seekers reached Australian shores. That, along with hundreds of lives lost at sea, effectively turned a point of fierce political disagreement into bipartisan